I had a request from Jane Thomas for this Christmas tree centerpiece. It's a table decoration. And I'm using aluminium wire, but you can use 0.8 or 1 mil, I would say, of silver plated copper. And I'm cutting 10 inches. I'm cutting 4 pieces. They're 10 inches long for this particular height of tree. And I'm straightening each one. Now, you've seen me do this before. It sort of work hardens and straightens the wire. You hold one end with one pair of pliers, and with the other end you hold with your flat nose pliers and pull and twist at the same time, and this will straighten and slightly work harden the wires, but you do need the wires to be straight to get started. So you've got 5 lengths. These are 10 inches long, and I'm holding them all together into a bunch, and I've cut a bit of 0.4 26 gauge of binding wire, and I'm just going to bind them together. It doesn't matter if they bunch up. I'm going to bind them about 2.5 inches away from one end. So you could actually put tape, because this is going to be covered. This is just to hold them together, so you could actually tape it at this point, but I'm using this binding wire just to really keep it nice and tight, bunch all these straightened wires up together. You don't want the binding to be too, I don't know, wider than an inch, but this is just just to keep them firmly together. So I'm just twisting the 2 ends so that I don't have 2 stalk ends. Just twisting them together, and then I'll bind the twisted stem around again. So there we are. I'm just bringing it around, cutting off the excess and making sure there's no raised bits. So that's now held in place at that point. And now I'm going to make a coil, which is going to be the stem or trunk of the tree. And I'm working actually off the spool, so I'm not cutting it as yet. I want it to be a good inch long, but I'm leaving a good inch at the end first. And I'm using my bail making pliers. You could use a thick knitting needle or a pencil. Basically, this coil has to slide over the bunch of wires that you've just bound together. It's got to be able to cover that binding. And I happen to know that my bail making pliers will, be adequate. I mean, you can make it wider than your binding because it's the trunk of the tree. So I'm just curling and curling on the spot to create an even coil of at least an inch to create this stalk or trunk. Let me show you how much. I've just over an inch here. And then I'm going to cut that off, leaving another projecting end. So that's going to be the trunk of the tree. And with these projecting ends, I'm going to be able to bind those ends much tighter to the stems, to those, it sort of really grips it. And you do it on both sides. And that covers all the binding that you just did. That's why I said you could tape it. You don't have to bind it with wire. You could actually put tape around. As long as you've sort of held it underneath, it gives it sort of an extra security. So this is sort of crimping it at the top and the base and making sure that it's not going to spin around. So that's going to be the trunk. Make sure it's sort of even and you haven't got big gaps. The next thing we're going to do is the roots and stand of the tree. So they're going to be the stand. And what you need to do is bend all of these wires out to become like a star shape. And so that they don't spin around, we're going to do a little bit of weaving at that base. So I'm using 0.4 mil, the 26 gauge again, as my binding wire, and I will cut, you know, a good 12 inches or an arm's length, whatever you want. And I find it easy just to find a little place that I can poke the end in to secure it. And then I'm just wrapping once around each of these stems. And initially this is going to be a little bit difficult because they're all moving, and so you've just got to keep your fingers holding them out in a sort of a, you know, like raise, because this is going to be your stand and you want it to be as stable as you can so that the tree can stand without wobbling over. So can you see I'm just wrapping once over and around each of these stems, and as you go round it becomes more and more stable and they stop sort of wobbling around. And keep doing that. We've done this before, it's just like doing the base of a basket. So you do use up all your wire until you feel it's completely, feels quite solid. Cut off any excess, neaten the ends. And you'll see that already gives you a base. There's your stand. I'm just going to hold it on a flat surface, so my steel block is the flattest place, and just very gently just tap down and make sure that we've got a nice flat central area. Now those projecting ends, what you want to do is, if you just make a sort of a wide a circle at each end, because you don't want sort of pointed ends of wire. So create a circle at the ends of each of those projecting wires, and you can also spiral those in a bit. It'll give it more stability. So there's the ends. Look, if you take your flat nose pliers and just curl it a little bit more like an open spiral using your flat nose pliers, that will create a nice stable base for the tree. And we can also hammer those to give them a little bit more support. It work hardens the wires and flattens them down. So do all that on your flat steel block. As I say, I'm using 1mm aluminium wire to show you this, but I've made these trees with 1mm silver plated wires as well. I have made them with 0.8 20 gauge, but they're a little bit more flimsy, and I would suggest that you'd have to make a smaller tree with the thinner wires. 1 mil is the sort of, seems to be the most sturdy. Right, so there's the start, and now I'm going to pull out 4 of those wires, keeping 1 at the center. So you want to sort of take them out so that you create this pattern. And you've got 1 central one, which is the stalk of the tree. And with the ends of these projecting wires, create some spirals. I'm starting off with just making small circles. And it's easier to go around each one because then they don't poke you. And now I'm going to start spiraling. So spiral them in towards the trunk of the tree. And I wouldn't go too far. I'd go in about, 2.5 inches or so, and then just leave them like that, because later on we can adjust this. So each one of these, spiral them in, but leave them sitting out, projecting out like that. The next thing is to make the actual tree. So I've cut about, it's a good 20 inches, but you can work off the end of a spool. And I'm starting off with a circle. I'm just going to trim that so I can get it quite circular. So there's the start. And now I'm going to hold that in my flat nose pliers and create, it's just a slight opening in my spiral. I don't want it too tight because this spiral has to end up as a cone shape. So can you see I'm leaving a gap in the space? And actually this lovely aluminium wire is, you can just use your hands. You don't need your tools. You can start off with your flat nose pliers and then just use your fingers. So keep going around and around. The size of the diameter of this spiral is really dependent on how big you want the base of your Christmas tree to be. So as I said, I had about 20 to 22 inches that I'd cut of the 1mm aluminium, and I can keep opening it up to make it a little bit bigger. So that's my choice of radius and base. See how you can sort of unwind it and spread it and make it a slightly bigger. And then with the end, because I don't want a cut end, I'm just going to curl that into a tiny little a little link there. So work on that for a bit, and once you're happy with the size, you can just gently tap with the steel part of your hammer, the planishing end. Just tap it down to work harden it. It will try and lift up, but persevere, because this is going to help it become more stable and tempered. The wire will become more tempered, and you can see it lifts up, so you have to hold it down where you're not hammering, and just stroke hammer all the wires, and that will flatten them a little bit. And don't worry if it's texturing them, because the texture actually adds a little bit of sparkle. So this is what we need to do to make it work hardened. So now it's much firmer. So the next bit is to pull out the center circle, and you sort of wiggle it out. So just go backwards and forwards and wiggle out those coils to create spaces between them and make this sort of an open cone. Obviously you could spend a long time trying to get this more even, the spaces more even, but don't worry too much at this point, because we're going to wire beads onto it, but you obviously want to make it as even as possible. And I'm just bending that to a right angle, that little end to a right angle to the cone. And you see that is going to slide on top and sit on that base. So you can have a look at it, see how high you want it. This is when you can sort of even out how long you want your tree to be. So with the center stalk, you can find beads that have holes that are big enough to sit and to be threaded over that. That's how you could do the center. You can just, add beads up to the tip of the coil that you've just made, the tree top. Now, it's not always easy to find beads that have big enough holes for 1mm wire. So if you can't, you've got no beads in your stash and you can't find beads that fit onto that 1mm central bit, you can always create coils. They're like spacer beads, and they will work. So I'm just showing you how I just make with my round nose pliers. I would just create, like you make jump rings really, and you can see how you could space out beads between your own coil spacer beads, and then that would, they can be fed all the way up to the tip of your spiral. But if not, this is another alternative, and I do this sometimes. I use the weaving wire. So this is the 0.4 again. Secure it to the base of that stem, and then I just pick beads that I want to wire around and space around that central column. So obviously the colors of these beads are completely dependent on what sort of centerpiece you want to make. You might want to use traditional red and green crystal beads. You might want to go for a completely different color of beads. I'm using something that's quite neutral. So I've found some old pearl beads that come off a broken necklace, and I've got some little crystal beads as well. So I'm going very, very neutral, and I'm just holding the bead on the stem, wrapping it around, and I'm going to fill up that central stalk as far as my, the length of my coil that I've just made. So that's an easy way of filling up the center. I mean, you could leave the center without any beads at all, but it's just adding another bit of, decoration. So can you see I've bound them up to the length of the coil. So those are lots of alternatives for the centerpiece. So the next thing we're going to do is we want to decorate the coil. Of course you could leave it plain and it would be quite a minimalist tree, but I'm going to show you how I do this. So this is again the 0.4, the binding wire, and I'm using the pearls and crystals, and I'm going to start off by binding it around the end of my coil where that sort of link was. I've actually left a little tail and then started the binding. And then I'm going to pick up each bead individually, place it on the base of that spiral cone, and wire wrap. So you just really got to hold it on that base. Wire wrap a couple of times near the bead, which holds it and secures it in place, and then move the wire along, leaving a little space to put your next bead on. Of course you could, wire the whole thing and keep all the beads very close to each other. That's really up to you. I just don't have the patience. And I like this sort of haphazard effect anyway. And it obviously goes much quicker, especially if you're making this to sell. So I've got a crystal now. So I'm going to go alternate pearls and crystals. They're all slightly different sizes. That doesn't matter. We're making it quite, organic. So you can see how this works. It's just thread each bead on, hold it to the coil base, wrap a couple of tight wraps near the bead, and then move it along, and then get ready for your next bead. And you go all the way along, and you can see why I said it didn't matter about, this cone shape if it's not perfect, because as you do this wrapping, it is going to distort a little bit because you have to get your fingers in between to wire wrap all these beads. So, you're going to have to come back and reshape that a bit. So carry on all the way up the coil. And can you see it's all gone a bit distorted? I'm just finishing off that last bit of wire at the top. And now I need to get my shape of the coil back because I've misshaped it with my wire wrapping. So push it back into the shape you wanted it and pull it into the height that you wanted it. That all takes a bit of time. And then place it back on your stand and just check that it's sitting as you want it. And then you've still got that little bit of wire jutting out from the first bit of weaving. So you can use that to secure around one of those projecting spiral stems on that base. And that gives you a bit of an anchor. And then you can look at each of those projecting spirals, and they're going to be what anchors that whole base in shape. So what I tend to do is sort of push my coil to the middle, my beaded coil of my tree to the middle. And then you can do this with your fingers or your pliers. You're just gently going to bend those stems upwards, and they will keep that coil in place on the tree. You might have to curl them down a little bit. You might find they're too big, I don't know, but I quite like them because they're decorative. So just spiral them down so they meet the base of the tree. There's so much adjustment to do after. So take your time, don't rush it. You want to get it as straight as you can and as decorative as you can as well. So you can see now I'm pushing those spirals sort of inward slightly, and that just holds that base spiral in place. So now we're left with just the top. You could add a bead to finish it off. If really anything goes, I think I'm going to put a clear crystal bead. And then I'm going to spiral the projecting end into a tight spiral. And that is going to be like the, fairy on top of the tree or the star on top of the tree. And on that spiral, you can do anything. You could glue a flatback diamante crystal, a pearl, flatback pearl. You can glue anything. But it just creates that decorative detail at the top of the tree. And that's really it. So spend your time adjusting it, and they're ready for the table. I've glued on I found a little pearl, a star one and a flatback one, and I've decided that's the finale to my tree. So there it is. And you can also hang little decorations on with jump rings. You could glue little glitter stars onto them, or you could keep it completely plain with a centerpiece. So thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial, Jane, and you make your own for this Christmas.